containment device that is used when dealing with hazardous materials. And it has a directional airflow that protects the users from getting contaminated or this hazardous material on them. And it is especially useful when someone's dealing with like aerosols or liquids that could like splash back and burn them to death, or, put a hole right through their skull, or, something like that. So that's what a BSC is.
Nice. All right, so that is what a BSL-2 is. Now let's talk about Biosafety Level 3, aka BSL-3. Now this BSL-3 has a lab that is appropriate for work involving microbes, which can cause serious and potentially lethal disease via inhalation as well as transmissions like BSL-2 stated. Example of a few of these that are contained in a BSL-3 would be yellow fever, St. Louis encephalitis, and the West Nile virus. Ooh.
So any work that is done inside of a BSL-3 must be strictly controlled, and it must be registered with all appropriate government agencies. The protective gear that is used for this level are usually solid front wraparound gowns, scrub suits or coveralls made from materials like Tyvek, and if necessary, respirators are used as well. Now this facility also has a self-closing double door access that is separated from general building corridors with directional airflow in which clean air is drawn into the lab with no recirculation. So they got that shit locked down. And also, we are going to provide a picture of someone dressed and using a BSC, which is the Biosafety Cabinet.
I always wondered what those were called. I saw them at the nuke plants, but never knew what they were called.
Yeah, a lot of the chemistry departments use those for when they, mess around with like RCS and stuff like that. So
deconning those were a pain.
Yeah, I bet. All right, so tell us about this next one.
Now for the last one, we're going to talk about the Biosafety Level 4, aka BSL-4. Now these facilities are extremely dangerous and pose a high risk of life-threatening disease. What these facilities contain could be anywhere from the Ebola virus to any agent with unknown risks of transmission. So pretty much the worst of the worst.
Now, of course, these facilities provide maximum protection and containment, along with the same requirements as all of the other safety levels as well, the 1, 2, and 3. Now, another thing that the BSL-4 labs have is that they're usually in separate buildings, or they're in a totally isolated zone that has dedicated supply and exhaust systems, which use a high-efficiency particulate air filter, aka HEPA filters, which I'm very familiar with those, and I know you are too, Dan.
I hate those things.
Yeah.
All right, so those are the basics for biosafety levels. But that brings us to the next question. How many labs are there in the world, and how many of them are level 3 and above? Well, if you are counting all of the biolabs in the world, even the level 1s and 2s, it's pretty hard to get a number. However, if you're counting just the level 3s and 4s, that we can actually narrow it down.
So in the entire world, there is a total of 1,400 BSL-3 labs. Now, the United States alone has around 300 total BSL-3 labs. Now, when it comes to the worst ones, the BSL-4s, there are around 59 of those labs that we know of in the entire world. And the United States has 12 of those total. And just a random knowledge nugget, Canada has 2 BSL-4 labs. So yeah.
That's some highly dangerous maple syrup. Anyways. Alright, so the 12 total BSL-4 labs that are located in the United States are all spread out. They are located in Georgia, Colorado, Massachusetts, Montana, Virginia, Washington, D.C. There's actually 3 in Maryland, 2 in Texas, and then 1 in Kansas.
Damn, so they're pretty much everywhere.
Yeah.
Everywhere across the United States.
Pretty much.
It's kind of scary to think about. All right. So that is some information regarding biolabs, what they are, where they are located, and all of that good stuff. So now that you have like a pretty good understanding of all that, let's transition into discussing the main reason why we did this episode today. Ukraine's biolabs. So Dan, can you start that off for us?
Absolutely. So in case you have been living under a rock for the past few weeks and haven't heard about it, well, Russia invaded Ukraine. And this happened exactly 1 month ago on February 24th, 2022. But why did Russia invade Ukraine? Before we explain that, we first need to go to Aaron's history class, because history plays a part in this explanation.
All right. So everybody sit your ass down. Welcome to Aaron's history class. Okay, Dan? Front and center. I like that. Okay, so we're going to start back in the Middle Ages, people. Okay? The land that Russia is in right now, well, that was ruled by the Golden Horde, aka the Mongols. Now, the Rus people, aka Russians, they came along and they were able to, have some beef with the Golden Horde, and they actually whooped them down. They overthrew them, the Mongols. They threw them out of the country. Now, for the next hundreds of years, Ukraine was Russia. Like, there was no difference between the two lands, all right? So I need you to fast forward to the year 1914. World War I came along. Now, only 3 years after that, Russia erupted into this super complicated civil war. Now, during this time, Ukraine revolted because they wanted to be independent. However, the Soviets came in and they were like, and they beat them down. Now, even though the Soviets spanked that Ukrainian ass for acting up, they bent them over and spanked their ass, spanked their little ass.
Oh.
The Soviets kind of felt bad. So they ended up giving them a republic. However, the republic was a part of the Soviet Union. Now, during Ukraine's time under the Soviet Union, Crimea, which is a very little small island on the bottom right side of Ukraine, well, that island was transferred to Russia. And this island, Crimea, to keep it short, is important because military-wise, it holds a nice Navy base in the Black Sea, and it can easily be used. So everybody wants a piece of that sweet Crimea ass, okay? But Ukraine gave it over to Russia. All right. Fast forward a couple decades later, and the Soviet Union collapses, okay? And guess what? Guess what happens right after that? Ukraine, they're independent. They're an independent country. They finally got their freedom, okay? So at this point, Ukraine started to lean towards Father Russia in foreign and domestic policies. And the Ukrainian government was pretty much pro-Russia. It was like, hey, they're our next door neighbor, they're our big brother or father, whichever way you want to look at it, and they kind of like followed their ways. However, in November of 2013, the president at the time in Ukraine ended up making a decision not to sign a free trade agreement with the European Union. And instead, he chose to grow closer with Russia. Very pissed at this. And for the next few months, there was an assload of protests that happened all over Ukraine. Shit got crazy over there, okay? All right. Following that, the Ukrainian government was replaced with a more pro-Western friendly government. Now, all the officials were more friendly towards the United States and less friendly towards the Russians. And those officials elected in Ukraine, they were all for America and the EU instead of Russia, okay? So when this happened, Vladimir Putin, who is the current president of Russia, well, he started to state his concerns about Ukraine joining NATO. Because, hey, Ukraine is now controlled by a bunch of government officials who like America and who like the EU, so it only makes sense for them to join NATO. Which, if you don't know what NATO is, Dan, why don't you tell us what NATO is?
Well, it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Basically, a whole bunch of countries signed up together so that if World War III started, they would know who they were fighting with. It's a gang of countries all over the world joining together.
100%. All it is just a big gang of countries, right? That said, hey, you want to join our gang? And the other country's like, well, fuck yeah, I do.
You got my back, I got your back.
Pretty much, right? Now, it's important to note that before the Soviet Union collapsed and pretty much turned into Russia, they had a thing called the Iron Wall and the Warsaw Pact, which is pretty similar to what NATO is. And it protected the Soviet Union from the West, okay? However, after the Soviet Union collapsed, that Warsaw Pact pretty much dissolved. But NATO, it didn't. Now you need to fast forward to today. It's been 2 decades since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and NATO has kept spreading east, slowly making its way closer and closer to Russia. And there it is. That's Aaron's history class of Russia and Ukraine in a nutshell.
All right. Thank you, Aaron, for that excellent history class.
You're welcome. I aspire to be a teacher one day.
Teach me, senpai. So, now that we know about Russia and Ukraine and its history along with NATO, now we could talk about why Russia invaded Ukraine, which is sort of complicated because a lot of people are saying different things.
Yeah. For example, the mainstream media has stated as to why Russia invaded Ukraine was because Putin wanted to overrun Ukraine, wanted to get rid of its government, which in turn would make it so that the country wouldn't want to join NATO anymore. However, Putin, on the other hand, actually did a televised address where he told the world as to why he invaded Ukraine. And it wasn't just because of NATO. There were multiple other reasons.
So this actual televised address that Putin gave was pretty long. But if you search it on YouTube, they only show about a minute of it. However, like I said, it was way longer than that. Now we do have a transcript of what Putin said, and we don't have time to go over the entire thing. However, if you do want to read it, then you go to the Patreon page and we will have it linked there for you to go and read.
Yeah, like the whole speech, I think video-wise, it was 12 minutes long.
Dang.
Pages, I think it was like 10 or 11 pages. I read the whole thing. I wanted to read the whole thing on here, but it's literally too dry, and I think it'd get too boring. So, if you want to, you can go read it. But to pretty much sum up Putin's announcement, what he said was that NATO was slowly expanding east, like we've already said, and that Russia has requested them to stop for some time now, and NATO pretty much has ignored him. Putin also stated that there is a genocide happening to millions of people who live in certain parts of Ukraine.
That this genocide is being conducted by the forces who staged the coup in Ukraine in 2014 and took over. That these forces are also neo-Nazis, and that because of all of these circumstances, that he will seek to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, as well as bring to trial those who perpetrated numerous crimes against its civilians.
So for the most part, that was the speech that Putin gave in a nutshell. And like we stated, we will have a link to the entire transcript of his entire speech if anyone wants to go read it. So that's the reason why Russia invaded Ukraine, according to Putin, okay? Now, why is this important to our topic on Ukrainian biolabs? Well, this is where our topic gets pretty interesting, because we're going to go over a timeline of this invasion and when the Ukrainian biolabs were actually brought up and what happened afterwards. So Dan, start it off.
So once the invasion started, Russia launched numerous missile attacks on various military installations, and then they started their ground invasion. A few days after that, Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov, who is over Russia's Radiological, Chemical, and Biological Defense Force, well, he held a news briefing. At this news briefing, he made some pretty crazy claims.
The Russian general claimed that the United States has covered Ukraine with as many as 30 biological laboratories, and that since their invasion has started, that Ukrainian authorities